To introduce our speakers and give us more information on this webinar series, we have Amelia, who works with the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center as a Tribal Resilience Liaison on with us today. Welcome, Amelia. Feel free to share your screen and share your camera and take it away.
White limlimt katsiayau inamwaswanik skumkanalks and chaisquis skumkanalks. My name is Amelia Marchand. I'm the interim senior tribal climate resilience liaison with the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, and that's a dual role with the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. I'm joining everyone today from the Colville Indian Reservation in North Central Washington State. So welcome, it's an honor to be here. I'm so excited to introduce the panelists that we have for this session on tribal policies around Indigenous knowledges. And what I'm going to do is first do an introduction for each of them. And then I'll, in our next slide, we'll also have a description of the image the beautiful image that you see on your screen. So our first speaker for this webinar is Aaron Jones, and he is the Treaty Rights Policy Analyst in the Treaty Rights and Government Affairs Department for the Tulalip Tribes of Washington. He's a Tulalip tribal member of Snoqualmie, Wenatchee, Duwamish, Malahat, Saanich, and Cowichan descent. He earned his undergraduate degree in pre-law and political economy and his master's in public administration from the Evergreen State College. Aaron represents the Tulalip tribes at the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge and Folklore, or IGC, to advocate for safeguards and protections for Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledges, traditional cultural expressions, and genetic resources associated with traditional knowledge in treaties being developed. Aaron has also represented the Tulalip tribes at the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, where safeguards and protections for traditional knowledges are threaded throughout negotiations. He also works on policy issues at the federal and state levels related to treaty rights, treaty reserved resources, cultural resources, natural resources, climate change and protection and safeguards of traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and genetic resources. Our second speaker is going to be Anne-Marie Shishili. Anne-Marie is the Executive Director at the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, or ITEP. She's responsible for managing ITEP's work with Northern Arizona University, state and federal agencies, tribes, and Alaska Native villages. Ms. Shishili currently and formerly has served on multiple federal advisory committees for the EPA, the Department of the Interior, and the National Climate Assessment, among several others. She speaks both nationally and internationally on topics of Indian law, environmental law, traditional knowledges, water law, and tribes and Indigenous peoples. And she co-wrote the document, Guidelines for the Use of Traditional Knowledge in Climate Change Initiatives. She's previously served as general counsel to the Gila River Indian Community, where she assisted implementing the historic Arizona Water Settlement Act and founded the community's renewable energy team. Ms. Shishili is an enrolled member of the Navajo Diné, earned her Juris Doctorate from St. Mary's University School of Law, and a master's in environmental law from Law School. A member of the National Bar Association, she's licensed in Arizona and has practiced in state, district, and federal courts. So I am going to be introducing our third speaker now. I apologize for my being flustered right now. So our third and final speaker will be Bobby Reed Sankey. He is Kiowa and he graduated from the University of Oklahoma College of Nursing and completed his graduate work in bioethics from Creighton University. Mr. Sankey began his employment with the Chickasaw Nation in 1997 as a registered nurse at the Carl Albert Indian Health Facility in Ada. He subsequently served as diabetes educator, manager of the Diabetes Care Center, and manager of the Department of Epidemiology, Research, and Population Health. He is presently the director of the Research and Public Health Division. Mr. Sankey serves as chair for the Chickasaw Nation Institutional Review Board, or IRB, the body that reviews research projects in the Chickasaw Nation. He's a tribal representative on the National Indian Health Service IRB, a certified IRB professional, and adjunct faculty in the Department of Health Promotion at the OU College of Public Health. He was recently appointed to his fourth term as the Oklahoma City area delegate to the National Institutes of Health Tribal Advisory Committee for Research. His primary interests are promoting tribal public health, creating tribal research infrastructure, strengthening research protections in tribal communities, and exploring the application of research and public health ethics principles within the context of tribal culture and sovereignty. So I'm so excited to have all of our wonderful speakers with us today. And if we progress to the next slide, this artwork that you see before you was created by Coral Avery, a Shawnee citizen who is working with the BIA branch of Tribal Climate Resilience out of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And with the next few minutes, I'm just going to read this introduction that Coral wrote for this wonderful artwork that they created. Although one image cannot fully encapsulate the expanse of Indigenous knowledges, this visual is intended to show the connection of Native species and Indigenous cultures stretching from the Pacific Islands to the East Coast of the United States. It includes the medicine wheel to symbolize the health and prosperity of people and environment. Turtle Island, which symbolizes either North America or both North and South America, depending on the storyteller. And water surrounds the image as it sustains all life. Inspiration for the image was taken from Native storytelling and the personal connections that members of the webinar series planning team and the artist have with these specific species and symbols. Thank you, Coral, again for your wonderful work, and thank you all for joining us today. Limlit, Katsiayo.
Aslachel, Dechop Kereb Tidsta, Stehilton Tidsta, Walchad Layla. Good day, everybody. My name is Aaron Jones. My traditional name is Dechop Kereb. My Malahat name, Stehilton. I'm from the Tulalip tribes. I'm Snoqualmie, Yakchi, Squamish, Malahat, Yanich, and Cowichan descent on both sides. My family, my grandpa and my grandma's side. And so I'm a member of the Tulalip tribes. And the Tulalip tribes are direct descendants and successors and interests to the Snoqualmie, Snohomish, Skykomish, and other allied bands signatory to the 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott. With that, when we hear the term of Indigenous knowledges, it really does ring true here at our tribes, because we have many families with many descendancies. So they're within that intricacies that we see, our Indigenous knowledges. So I do want to start off by going into our understanding of Indigenous knowledges. And so it is a fairly, phrase that tries to capture multiple, as I think you saw in the introduction of this webinar series. Many different terms can be used for Indigenous knowledges, like traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, that tends to be, I see, interchangeably with Indigenous knowledges. But other terms that are inherently related to this discussion as well as traditional cultural expressions and genetic resources associated with traditional knowledge. And part of the inclusion of these other terms that I have on this slide is because at the World Intellectual Property Organization, at the negotiations there for IGC, so traditional cultural expressions and genetic resources are individual treaties being negotiated there in relation to Indigenous knowledges of Indigenous peoples, seeking to find protections within law-binding treaties that hopefully we can see implemented and finished internationally and then adopted by the US federal government. And that is some years away, but that is one hope of many approaches to finding ways to protect Indigenous knowledges for tribes and Indigenous peoples. And so when we enter this conversation about Indigenous knowledges, I just want to kind of reiterate that this can cover many different aspects of our lives inherently here at the Tulalip tribes. And I just want to ensure that and determine for you that my presentation is more geared toward our federal trustees. And of course, I'm excited that others have been able to join this presentation and hopefully helps contribute to the dialogue and discourse of this topic as well. So I wanted to start off when it comes to tribal policies for Indigenous knowledge. One thing I want to reiterate is under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 31, where it states that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expression. And this internationally just asserts that Indigenous peoples, such as tribes, have that sovereignty, have that self-determination to maintain and control and protect our cultural heritage and Indigenous knowledges, as well as this is another method just to demonstrate, to the US that, these laws don't need to be tangible, such as in tribal codes. These laws can also be in customary laws and protocols, such as that is handed down orally, passed on traditionally, and that it is protected in the collective of the sovereign. And so I did include paragraph 2 as well of Article 31 in the declaration, which is that conjunction with Indigenous peoples, states shall take effective measures to recognize and protect the exercise of these rights. And it's important that we see at the federal level here domestically in the US that there's an active role from the federal government to seek being proactive, finding positive protections to our Indigenous knowledges, which is the inherent and fundamental right of Indigenous peoples and tribes here in the US. This is a kind of a main drive for the Tulalip tribes to participate at WIPO. We just want to ensure that, since time immemorial, all the knowledge handed down from our ancestors to our elders today who are passing on the knowledge to the current generation and the future generation, that we don't lose knowledges to Western IP, legal regimes, or to other aspects that can try and dwindle away, give us a death by 1,000 cuts around protecting our Indigenous knowledge. So with that stated, there are risks to Indigenous knowledge and risks to participating with the US federal government around research and around resource management. And these risks can include inappropriate disclosure of Indigenous knowledges, misappropriation, and misuse. Why I'm bringing this up is from Tulalip's point of view. Anytime that we engage with the federal government around the use of Indigenous knowledge for resource management or to be included in kind of exploratory research, We just need to be aware that there are federal laws that can put our Indigenous knowledge, into what the Western IP legal regime would consider as publicly available or in the public domain, which we fundamentally disagree with. As since the creation of Western IP law, tribes were never consulted about how our Indigenous knowledges would be treated and would be, interacting with intellectual property law regimes. So we have to be aware of the Freedom of Information Act. First and foremost, any kind of records or documentation of Indigenous knowledge that gets handed to the federal government, or anything that the federal government staff hears and takes notes of, could be subject to the Freedom of Information Act, depending. There are currently no policy protections for tribes when it comes to our Indigenous knowledge and when it's in the hands of the federal government. The only one that comes to mind, and it's very narrow, is with the USDA Farm Bill. There is one stipulation within the Farm Bill that allows the executive secretary of the USDA to make exempt from public disclosure traditional knowledge around sacred sites. So it's very narrow, but it is a little example of how we can try and find ways to do policy fixes to prevent inappropriate disclosure for FOIA. And so other risks too, as once traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge is becomes it's out there to the public or to commercial and industry businesses, is misappropriation, or not just misappropriation of how we use the knowledge, but in just the phrases, and that can lead to many harms to our people. And that's not just like an economic harm that might come to mind, but also the spiritual, the cultural, and physical health that's attached inherently with our knowledge. We mistreat that knowledge, there's a lot of harm done to ourselves. And we just, as those safeguarding this knowledge, we just want to be sure that there's these protections, so misappropriation and misuse don't lead to these harms, don't lead to Indigenous knowledge or traditional cultural expressions, or even our natural resources, to be misused in a way that our ancestors did not want them to be, or our elders today do not want them to be used. So for us, it's very important to find ways to not let these risks take over and not let these risks go unchecked when interacting with the federal government on research and around resource management. And so one thing I want to touch on, so we are talking about tribal policies. I want to touch on tribal sovereignty and governance of IK. And so we have, since 1934 with the Indian Reorganization Act, we have these modern governments of tribal government that we see today. And we have many tribal codes and policies that are underneath these tribal, governments. But, inherently with our Indigenous knowledge, we have customary laws and protocols. And these are, more oral, and not all the time. They're not generally written down all the time, but they can be, depending on the sovereign, self-determined decision of whether to make that written, in a tribal code, or just written, or documented. But for a lot of my family's, lifeways, it is passed down orally, and protocols around our Indigenous knowledge are done orally. So when it comes to, federal governments interacting with us, there are many elements that you might not see written down, and that does create a relationship between us and federal agents to try and determine, and I'll get this to the next slide, we'll try and determine what direction we want to go with, whether or not to engage in research or resource management related to IK. And I did want to highlight that there are many, terminology floating around governance. There's tribal codes, customary laws, and protocols, as well as Indigenous laws. But a more broad one that I think encapsulates more is Indigenous legal tradition, which is unique to the sovereign since time immemorial, as well as not always available in written form. So I just wanted to highlight them. But Indigenous legal traditions is I think a phrase that federal trustees should be aware of and try and understand that it's unique to the sovereign and with their engagement, that not all engagement, might be appropriate for each sovereign. So engaging with the Tulalip tribes for indigenous knowledge's utilization, context really matters as to why you want to integrate IK into research or management, how your agency will treat, respect, or protect the IK in your research and management. And this really just goes to, you have to know your own policies to be transparent with us about, are there actually ways to protect, our indigenous knowledge when engaging with our tribe? And we're very cognizant of trying to find ways to still work with you, to still contribute to the best available science on resource management or for research. But when it comes to, land and management or salmon recovery, we do believe our knowledge is, what keeps the salmon alive, keeps us alive as well. And so trying to find ways to do that respectfully in ways that protects our indigenous knowledge is important. And sometimes that's just not always an option. So we have to be aware of that, cognizant of that as we work together. And then also another aspect to consider is what happens with the IK once it's shared with the federal agency. Will it become, will it go through a FOIA process and be publicly disclosed or inappropriately disclosed? Are there, benefits, that go both ways for everybody? Is it going to be something that contributes to all of society? Is it something that's going to, also benefit tribes and, are disproportionate, positions many times within society? Like, where are we just being used, or is there a way that, we also benefit from, divulging or using indigenous knowledges, research and management? And, I think from what I saw in the first webinar, there's a mention of free, prior, and informed consent. And so I think that, from Tulalip's standpoint, that's something we do believe that it's important for the US federal government to follow ethic principles. And, what does that look like when engaging with, the Tulalip tribes when you want to access, explore, or document or indigenous, knowledges? And a lot of that has to go with contacting the tribal chair to start with, tribal leadership, the council, and they'll get the appropriate staff involved, through this process of how can we actually engage with the federal government on this research or on this management processes, or is this, something that's not going to genuinely be meaningful to our tribe to engage with? And, it's important to start with leadership because, the principles of FPIC with the word free is for the collective, and that's for the sovereign. So free, prior, and informed consent, starts with the leadership of the sovereign. We keep it government to government, and kind of with that, I wanted to highlight that in general, it's not an FPIC principle to go and directly contact who you identify as knowledge holders within our tribe. Important in a government to government process that you start with leadership, and if you have ideas of who you want to talk to, that's what we got to explore. But we just need to ensure that we're protecting our elders and our knowledge holders, from inappropriate disclosure, misappropriation, or misuse of knowledge. So with ethics, there's that meaningful engagement, hopefully early and often engagement as well. And so an example I just want to provide you, and then I'm probably running close to time, is when it comes to databases and information systems. This is a big one for us to ensure that knowledge that is stored, created, accessed by many users, utilized, there are guiding principles to ensure that there's safeguards around it, and there's going to be indigenous knowledge that federal government or federal agency uses or program uses to store indigenous knowledge, that we just want to make sure that ethic principles are followed, and that includes creation, content, access, uses, and safeguards must be developed and carried out in conjunction with tribes, and that could be done with the many sovereigns, and that can be unique to the many sovereigns. So you need to have, that ability to engage with the sovereigns in a government to government fashion. We need to ensure that, these databases do no harm to the tribes. So we need to make sure that, the rights are not infringed upon facilitating the information or data, and it doesn't lead to the possibility of appropriate disclosure, misappropriation, or misuse of Indigenous knowledge, sacred sites, or resources. And tribes need to have the right to access, remove, or correct data and information. That is just an exercise of our sovereignty, within an agreement to work government to government. And we just need to ensure that your sources are cited appropriately and that the incorporation of the data and information is done in good faith and in a respectful way. And if there's confidential or culturally sensitive, secret or sacred Indigenous knowledges, we just need to have the right to also remove those from a database or information system, in the event that that is there. And we always, if you engage with Tulalip, we want to ensure that with databases or information systems, there are positive protections to ensure that the exclusive rights of the Indigenous knowledge shared by us is protected in response to the Tulalip tribes. That's unique to each sovereign, right? Each sovereign should have that exclusive right to their Indigenous knowledge. So I just wanted to provide that as a brief example. This is something I could talk about for many days on end with people, and I want to engage more in this topic with others. And so I just want to thank you for the time. Thank you, folks. And may the 4th be with you. It's a little nerdy, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you.
Let's start again. Good afternoon. I'm Anne Mauritius Chile, and I'm so honored to be here today. Thank you, Aaron, for that incredible presentation. I geek out on intellectual property issues as well. So thank you for that. Yate, Shea Anne Mauritius Chile, Dashijine, not ordinary, touching insulin, Origini, Washington, Hanagani, Dashiche, Ado, my Dashkisni Dashinella. And they shan't hold, I don't just chimito, I use Nasha, Can everyone hear me all right? I'm going to try to speak as loud as I can today. All right, well, thank you. I'm coming to you from Flagstaff, Arizona, 7,300 feet up in the air. We got lots of snow this winter. And you can see in this picture, you can see the Native American Cultural Center here at Northern Arizona University. I'd like to acknowledge the lands I'm on. I'm on lands sacred to 13 tribes, including my own, the Dene College. And I just want to acknowledge and say hello in all our different languages from this territory. So Indigenous traditional ecological knowledges, this, as Aaron said, this term has been changing, evolving. And I think this is the most inclusive of all the different terms, traditional knowledges, traditional ecological knowledges, Indigenous knowledges. So this term, I'm going to use ITEK for this session today. And so for me, I'm going to walk you through how I came into ITEKs. First of all, the ITEKs are innate. For us as Indigenous people, they come to us in our dreams, in our spirituality, in our teachings as young children, in our dances and our cultures. So, a lot of people ask me to define it. What are the key words, concepts, and ideas and stories and images? And it takes a while to get through the definition. And so I really wanted to lay a foundation of what these terms ITEK means. But most importantly, when speaking about ITEKs, the energy that I bring is really important. I have to, as a traditional Dene woman, I have to sage myself. I have to make sure that I'm in good mind because we're talking about something sacred. So that's really important for me to express because all these things lead to who we are as Indigenous peoples, and they're very, very important in our discussion today. So let's look at the definition just at a 30,000 foot level. The ITEKs are valuable, significant, and valid on their own. Incredibly important to say valid on their own. They must not be validated by any Western sciences. I think that's one of the most important things that I come across is a lot of people often say, okay, how does that relate to Western science? And I say, it may relate, but it's not, I don't have to validate Indigenous knowledges through other methodologies or ideologies. So just a very important thing. Also, ITEK, we have our own internal methods of defining. every nation will be different, every person will be different, and how they define and how they value it, or validating our own knowledges. They come from communities, they come from our ancestors, they come from our elders. All this information is important to understand that there's no one set definition. So it's important when you work with communities and tribal nations that you understand that their definition is what's important to them. For me, it breaks it down to my grandmother, my late grandmother, and my son. He's now 16, but the knowledge transferred from my grandmother to my mother, to me, to my son. That's in an essence what traditional knowledges are, our ITEKs are. So I just wanted to break it down really easily. Oops, go for it. Okay, so some of us are visual learners, so I'm going to break it down in a different way. So Western and ITEKs, so I have two pictures here. The gentleman on the left-hand side is taking measurements of water, water quality, water quantity issues. And so that's, it's very deductive. You get all your data and you put it all in a system, and that's what Western science is built on, the methodology, and that's great. On the right-hand side, you'll see, and I call him my Che, my uncle or my grandfather. He's also got some knowledges because he comes to that stream every single day with his sheep. And this is very Navajo because we take our sheep to the water sources every day to water. And so he knows just as much, or maybe even more about that water system that he's going to. So when I came into this ITEK, it was around 2013, 2014, when tribes were coming to me and they were concerned because they could not apply for any grants using their ITEKs because they're saying the grantees or the sponsors were not allowing them to use ITEK. So that was a concern for me. So when we worked with, I sat on a federal advisory committee. It was the first advisory committee for Department of Interior. So at the time it was Sally Jewell, if you remember her. So we had our first committee and we began working with her and developing what ITEKs, or at the time traditional knowledges, were. So in 2015, right before the administration turned to Trump, we came out with the guidelines for the use of traditional knowledges in that federal advisory committee. And this was for the whole USGS under DOI. So it was a very important document that came out. And what we recommended in that were these guidances. And how does the tribes work with state? How does state and federal governments work with tribes? So a lot of that conversation was very difficult to understand. So this was the first recorded history of when the federal government actually looked at Indigenous knowledges and what does it look like, how is it defined? So Aaron, my colleague just before me, talked about the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Principles. So I'm not going to go through that. He also spoke about free and prior informed consent. That was the principles. So those are all United Nations principles, but under our new guidances, we included them to make them US policy. Now it's a little trick there. So you take all those principles and then you incorporate them so that they're now being applied in the United States under this new guidance. And for me, I'm now working at a university level, and one of the biggest concepts we're looking at is indigenizing. So one of the things we're looking at to incorporate when we're looking at ITEKs is how do you indigenize it into? So indigenize is a concept that comes from after decolonization. So decolonization is taking all the bad policies, rules, regulations that hinder tribes or indigenous peoples from securing or using their rights or their ways of, or protecting their ways of being. And then you move into, once that's all cleared out, I like to think of it as like a garden. You clear all that out and then you start planting in seeds of indigenization. What will be helpful to tribes? What are new policies that would be helpful? In this case, what are new laws and policies around indigenization or around ITEK would be helpful? And so that's the way we bring into this new policy and this new policy thoughts, if you will, is indigenizing our way of life. Let's see if I can move this without messing it up too much. Okay, so the principles of engagement under this the guidances that we put forth is, of course, Aaron said, cause no harm. recognize tribal sovereignty. I think those are two principles that should be easy, but unfortunately, a lot of times are not applied. Recognizing the tribal governing council, governing leadership, and making sure that we work closely with them. Free and prior and for consent, as I said, it was already established. Free means uncoerced. It should be unbiased. Freedom for Indigenous peoples to set their own procedures. Prior, Indigenous peoples, and this comes around research because I do tribal consultation for the university. Tribes should be involved from the beginning of the process in the design concept phase. A lot of times folks will come out to the nations and say, oh, I have funding. Would you like to join my proposal? That is exactly what you don't want to do. So I'm just cautioning you on that. Consent should be approved at that level. And it also should be approved in the IRB process if you're working with research issues. Informed. Each person who's involved with your project should be informed on what the pros and cons are. They should be, especially with you're dealing with elders or knowledge holders, they should be protected at a higher level. Working with folks, because contractual relations are incredibly difficult for someone to read. And so having that extra layer of protection for Indigenous knowledge holders is probably one of the most important things I will recommend for all of you. Consent, there's consent to say yes, but there's also a consent to say no. And this consent to say no occurs anytime during the process. So I just wanted to make sure that, once you get going, once you're in the middle of the process, there's always the ability for the tribal members or knowledge holders to say, no, we're not comfortable with this. And we want to say, we don't want to continue forward. And that's their right. So that was the principles. And now let's move into the guidelines. Okay, I'm going to move one little thing out of the way. So one of the things as an attorney, you should understand key concepts and definitions. So that's one of the first things you lay out in any contract. What does it mean for Indigenous knowledges for the Tulalip tribe, for the Navajo Nation, for the Hopi Nation? What do those means? Where are the parameters on? What can you talk about and not talk about? What are some good things and what are some things you absolutely cannot discuss at all? So these are understanding terms and concepts, and definitions are probably the primary first thing you should be doing. Recognize that, again, this is the part of our principles. Recognize that Indigenous peoples and holders of Indigenous knowledges have the right not to participate. Understand that and communicate risks for Indigenous peoples and knowledge holders. So a lot of folks, our Indigenous knowledge holders, our elders, they're very, very generous with the information, their songs, their prayers, their medicines and how they use it. And a lot of times they're doing it out of their genuine just goodness of their hearts. But a lot of that is all considered intellectual property and could be stolen. So they have to understand that if they use any of that information or any of those practices in a public forum or on a video or being addressed in any of your research, they should be well aware that it will be most likely in public domain. So the reciprocity, first the protections around them should be acknowledged. If they're clearly okay with it, then I would say move forward. If they're not clear about or hesitant, I would be very careful with some of that information. So I just wanted to clarify that part. If you're federal government or state government or any organization, please establish institutional interfaces by developing formal research agreements. These could be considered IRB in the university settings, but they also can be contractual agreements that you look at, or make sure you have a resolution from the tribe. There's nothing more, I used to work in tribal government, nothing more harmful is if you start research or start a project and then your whole tribal government changes, your governor, your chair, all changes, your council changes. And then you go back in and you say, oh, here we are, stage 3 out of 4. And that's like, who are you? And who gave you the right to do this project? And if you don't have that tribal resolution, you're going to be stuck in a really hard place. I've seen it happen. So I just want to caution you, get resolutions or get an MOU with the tribe that you're working with. Highly recommend those. Number 5, provide training for staff and early and often. So this comes as just something that, like we're doing today. Training is probably one of the most vital things that you can do to have everyone on your team understand. There's nothing more harmful to have like an associate come in and they say something completely incorrect, or they harm the relationship by disclosing information or talking about information that you've already set precedent that you're not going to talk about. So really make sure your staff is well trained on all these different issues. Provide specific directions to ensure that the protections are upheld. So this just goes to, again, those MOU agreements. How are you going to arbitrate? Should things go awry, as we all know things go, what's going to happen? Are you going to be in tribal court? Are you going to be using a mediator? God forbid you have to go to state or federal courts. You know, those are just things that should be talked about before you go into these long-term agreements, because it will be very damaging if you get to that place where you don't know how to resolve issues. So highly recommend that. Recognize the knowledge, multiple knowledge systems and holders. So this, I like to use the example of, my nation, the Navajo Nation. You know, we have what's called, I used to be a policy worker or policy advisor for the Diné Atawhli Association, which is the Navajo Medicine People Association. And so they work with many knowledge holders throughout the entire community. There's probably over 100 that are in my community alone that are considered Atawhlis or medicine people. So each one of them has a different saying. So when you come into the community, understand that one person doesn't speak for all of them. One person, one knowledge holder may have a ceremony that may run one way, but it's very different. So just be careful when you're talking to one that we're not generalizing for the whole community. Just another thing. And then develop guidelines for review of grant proposals. Of course, these are folks that you're working at the university level. Make sure that there's a review process, your IRB process or advisory committee. One of the biggest things you can do to help your project is to have an advisory committee made up of community members, and especially have like elders, professionals, and if you can, it'd be awesome if you could also include youth as well. So those are the guidelines. I want to take about ITEK's evolution through what I've seen through the years. And I'm an environmental attorney, so I've really seen it through the EPA lens or environmental protection lens. So the first report, as I said, came out in 2015. This was the guidelines. This is the first time I ever saw anything written on traditional knowledges. And so that was the first set of rules, and they came out in 2017 under the considering traditional knowledges during cleanup processes. So this memorandum came out. And then for the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, the CEC, then also incorporated traditional experts rosters. So this is the EPA working with Canada, United States, and Mexico. And so all countries have Indigenous knowledge holders on this committee advising them, which is one of the best things I saw. But all importantly, I know there's a lot of others, but this is just I'm jumping through a lot of different ones. Was last 2021 when the President Biden put out the ITEK and federal decision making. So they went through tribal consultation all last fall and early spring. And then the next step was to take all those comments from everybody and then start writing guidances for each agency. So just the end of May coming up will be the deadline for all the different agencies to turn in their guidances on how they will be applying ITEK to their agencies. So this is going to be really, really interesting. I'll be working with DOI. There's a group of Indigenous folks this summer on helping DOI take that information and make policies and guidances for the Department of Interior. I'm assuming each one of the agencies are also doing the same. But this is a huge, huge win for Indigenous peoples just to have it went all the way from not even recognizing it, no one knowing what it is, to now being a policy that's being applied to every agency. So big win for all the folks around the country that have been working on this issue for a long, long time. So I want to just impress one incredible new report. I guess it's not so new because it's now about 2 years, but the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals here at Northern Arizona University put out the Status of Tribes and Climate Change report. And some of you may be authors on it. So this is the, it's like a snapshot and what's happening with tribes. And the most incredible thing is it's written by all tribal authors and tribal narrators. So the authors looked at the high level things, the scientific things that climate change is imposing on different regions throughout the country. And then we have 34 tribal narrators that actually says, this is what's happening in our community. But most importantly, these are the recommendations that are coming from our tribes. There's so many meetings I went to, and so many times they would ask me, what do the tribes want? And I would always say, well, I'd list my list, but this is actually a factual document that will be cited, that's been cited in the IPPC, that will be cited in NCA 5, National Climate Assessment 5. It will also being used by the Senate and a lot of the policymakers on the Hill about exactly what tribes want and how they want to see advancements in the climate change arena come forward. So this is a really good document, highly recommend it. And that's it. I'm going to go ahead and cut off. I know I could go on and on as well, but I just want to say thank you on behalf of Northern Arizona University. I'm really proud to be here, and thank you for all the other speakers. I'm learning quite a bit today. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for inviting me to meet with y'all and chat for a little while this afternoon. I've really enjoyed the presentation so far, the way they overlap in their concepts and in the ideas and in our efforts, to preserve our culture and our heritage. And so I really do appreciate you asking me to speak. Most of my presentation will pertain directly to research activities in the Chickasaw Nation, because that's what I know the best. So how we came about with our Chickasaw Nation IRB, why we developed it, and what we think makes it a little bit different than the traditional IRBs, which are institutional review boards that review research projects. Generally, they're academic settings, they're commercial settings, but I know that many tribal communities now are developing their own research activities and their review activities, whether it be an IRB or not. So, so I just always like to start with giving folks a little bit of a context for those who are not that familiar with Indian country. This slide shows the distribution of First American population across the United States, by county. And the states with the largest populations are California, Oklahoma, New Mexico, South Dakota, and Montana. And in the Chickasaw Nation, we've adopted the term First Americans for indigenous peoples. And so that's the term that I'll be using today. And there are presently 573 sovereign tribal nations that are, as you can see, are scattered around the country. In Oklahoma, where I'm from, there are 39 tribes have their headquarters here in Oklahoma. And each of these tribes have inherent sovereignty. We've heard that several times already today. And they have the right to self-governance and self-determination. A majority of the tribes, that you can see here on this Oklahoma map, are not native to this area. There are actually only a few tribes out in western Oklahoma that are native to this area. Most of the tribes that are here, that have their headquarters here, were forcibly and very cruelly removed from their own traditional homelands to what was then known as Indian Territory through the period of Indian removal in the mid-1880s, 1830s, mid-1880s. So as a result, Oklahoma tribes are not a homogeneous group. There's a wide variety of culture and history and language, traditions, and even governance styles within the tribes in Oklahoma. I'm in the Chickasaw Nation, which you can see is in the center, at the lower part in the center in the orange. That large encompasses 13 counties. And you can see some of these tribes are very small, occupy a very small area in Oklahoma, others quite large. And this map is a graphic visual of the impact of removal on tribes across the nation. You can see from the far points of the United States that tribes were forcibly removed and relocated to Oklahoma. As I mentioned, there's 39 tribes that have their headquarters here, but you can see that the number of tribes that were relocated here is actually quite a bit more than 39. Some of those tribes don't really have a presence here in Oklahoma anymore. Some went back to their own homelands. Some of them, the smaller ones, don't even exist anymore. They were absorbed into other tribes that were here. But I think it's pretty a pretty kind of graphic representation of what removal really meant for these tribes, and how and why Oklahoma has a unique tribal presence, and that most people don't really understand. So there is a very long and troubled history of research with tribes. There's been a lot of issues. Research has been conducted in tribal communities for many, many years. Unfortunately, tribal communities have, and they still are, being targeted as research populations of convenience. And unfortunately, unethical practices have led to research abuse. And and it's not just historical. It's fairly recent too that tribes, there's been research abuse in tribes, and so this has resulted in mistrust of researchers and reluctance on the part of tribes to participate in research. And that means that tribes are either targeted with research that is not helpful to them. It also means that we're often, because we don't want to participate, we're left out of research that may actually be beneficial to tribes and to tribal members. And so we need to find that balance between not being over-researched, not being tribal target populations of convenience, but also not missing out on the potential benefits that we have that may come out of research. And I think probably if for those of you that are in research with tribal communities, the Havasupai tribe versus the Arizona Board of Regents is a pretty commonly cited case of research abuse, honestly, in the tribe. And in this particular instance, the Havasupai tribe that had very high rates of diabetes and enlisted a geneticist to come to their tribe to do some research, some genetic research to find out if there was some genetic causes, some genetic basis to the high rates of diabetes in that tribe. So they invited the geneticist out, and they did this research, and they were not able to find anything actually genetically, any genetic component to their diabetes rates. However, the researcher had other interests as well, and so not found any diabetes-related findings, they proceeded to do some other studies on these blood samples that they had taken from the Havasupai, and they did some other studies on schizophrenia and on the origin of the Havasupai, and some migration studies. Inbreeding on the tribe, and alcoholism. The Havasupai live at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, so talk about a population of convenience. They are all located in that area and have been, since time immemorial, and all of their traditions and customs revolve around them having, been there in the Grand Canyon forever. So this went to court once it was found out what the researchers had done, and the defense was that the consent documents, and I heard Aaron and Marie Ann also talked about consent, was a broad consent, and the broad consent said it said that they would be studying diabetes, but also the causes of other behavioral and medical disorders. And so under that defense, they did all these other studies. They were published. Some of these were published. In fact, the way that this was discovered, this whole case was discovered, was that there was a Havasupai student at the university who observed a presentation on this. I believe it was on schizophrenia. And then during the presentation realized it was her tribe that they were talking about. And that's how it first came out. And so As you can imagine, these public presentations of the data and the papers resulted in great community harm and embarrassment and distrust and emotional distress. And so this case was settled out of court in 2010 and resulting in monetary damages being awarded to the Havasupai and the return of the biospecimens. But, the damage was done. The damage was already done. And the fact that so many people, use this case as an example of research abuse in tribes just shows you that, that you can't go back. So this is the most cited case, but it's not the only case by far. So there are some ethics principles. We've also talked about ethics a lot and ethical principles so far today. But if you are involved in research, you know that the ethics principles are outlined in a document that's called the Belmont Report. And it is comprised of 3 different principles. So the first one being respect for autonomy, and that is expressed in informed voluntary consent. So we've talked a lot about consent as well today. And these principles were devised to protect individual participants who were taking part in research. So if you as an individual wanted to sign up to be a participant in a research project, then the researchers applied these principles to you as an individual to protect you during the research process. And so the respect for autonomy is expressed by informed voluntary consent. Its beneficence is expressed as an individual being given all the information about the research project, and then you make your own individual assessment of your own personal risk benefit to participate in this study. And then justice, the principle of justice, which is the third ethics principle, is fairness in recruitment and selection of participants. So everyone should have an equal opportunity to participate or not to participate in a research project. So these are very individual, these were principles that were applied to individual participants. But in response to the unethical research practices that were happening in tribal communities in the early 2000s, researchers such as Dr. Bill Freeman, who some of you may have heard of, who's very well known to have started work in this area, they were interested in promoting tribal research protections by applying these individualized research ethics principles described in the Belmont Report to include tribal communities as well. So in other words, you would consider the whole tribal community as a research participant. So informed voluntary consent, you would have informed voluntary tribal review and approval and consent. So for the principle of beneficence, the tribe will determine whether or not the risk, benefit, and possible harm to the tribe is worth participation. Because one thing that's very important, and we've heard that over and over today about self-determination and self-governance, is that only tribes have a different perspective when it comes to research of what is risk and what is benefit and what harm is. Only a tribe can determine whether or not a research project is going to be beneficial or too risky to the tribe as a whole. And also the tribe will determine whether or not they're being used as a target population of convenience, but also they want the opportunity to be included in research in case there are possible benefits to the tribe as a whole. So this whole idea of applying these individualized ethics principles to the tribe itself has really taken a foothold in the past few years, actually. So, and there has been, like I say, Dr. Freeman was the one that really started talking about this, but there have been other researchers in the past 10, 20 years that have talked about applying these principles to groups as well as to individuals. So, and even Beecham and Childress in their latest edition of Principles of Bioethics, which is sort of the authoritative text for biomedical research principles and guidance. They added actually a chapter on the Havasupai case in their most recent edition that talks about and underlines the need that we need to attend to the group as well as individual harms. So here within the Chickasaw Nation, in the late 1990s, we were approached to engage in some research projects, particularly in the area of diabetes, as we saw in the Havasupai, and that wasn't uncommon because there was so much diabetes in our communities, and so there was a lot of funding actually for research, and so we started being approached by different academic partners, primarily academic medical institutions, to participate in research projects, and we didn't really have an infrastructure to address that. We didn't really know how to go about doing that. So in the 1998, our Governor Bill Anatoby established our Research Review Board by executive order, and then that was followed shortly by a legislative act as well. And then we used guidance from every source that we could find. The Office of Human Research Protections, the federal codes governing research, the Indian Health Service, IRB, and also our own Chickasaw Nation policies all came into play as we developed our research review process. And the thing that differentiates IRBs, tribal IRBs, from academic or commercial IRBs, again, is that not only are we protecting the safety of our individual research participants, but we are charged with guarding the integrity and heritage of the Chickasaw Nation as a whole. And so also when you talk about applying these research ethics, which are, obviously they're Western research ethics principles. There's no question about it. But you can apply those within the context of tribal communities. But I think there's additional ethical considerations that you need to be aware of. And of course, the first one is sovereignty. So tribal sovereignty, as we've already discussed, is the right for tribal self-determination and self-governance. And that, and that includes the conduct of research. So tribes have the right, they have the authority to determine how research is going to be conducted in their own communities. And that's a fairly new concept, particularly for academic research institutions to think that tribes have the authority to say, as we heard earlier, yes or no, consent or not to participate in a research project. And if you think about sovereignty within the context of those research ethics principles, then the respect for sovereign rights is an expression of the respect for autonomy or respect for individual persons. And similarly, within that research, within the research ethic principles, there's a justice principle called solidarity, and that's the community expression of justice and beneficence. And so it's important that, because sovereignty describes a government relationship. It's inherent, but it still is describing a relationship between two governments. You can have a sovereign nation that does not take care of its people very well. You don't have to look very hard or very far to find a sovereign nation that does not take care of its people. So I think what really separates tribal communities is not only do we have the sovereignty to do this, to be self-determined and to be self-government, including research, but we have this collective responsibility, which is the solidarity for our tribe's continual survival and flourishing, and that's what provides the moral legitimacy for tribal research protection efforts. And so to me, not only is sovereignty and solidarity are sort of twin pillars that you have to have both of those and apply both of those to really, particularly in the arena of research protections, but I think that goes more broadly beyond that as well. But I think those are the twin pillars of justifying within the research context why we can justify extending those research protections beyond research, just individual research protection. So Sovereignty and solidarity, twin pillars for tribal communities. So these are just some examples of our Chickasaw Nation tribal policies that they were in 2019, the Common Rule, which is the federal guidelines that govern research. They changed some of their policies, and so it's more important now forever for tribes to review and update or adopt written research laws and codes that put in place the policies that we want, the protections that we want for our tribal citizens and community to participate in research. So, you know, the broad consent that I mentioned in the Havasupai, that is allowed in the federal guidelines, but there are exceptions to those as long as there is a written tribal law. The Common Rule also does not include specific procedures for saying that if you're doing research with the tribe, that the tribe must review it, but it does require that federally funded researchers have to obey written tribal laws. And so it's very important to have these codified in law so that you can point to them and say, we are accepted from this particular rule because we have it written down right here. I want to go back a little bit because I'd missed the one on NIH. The first two bullets are for the Common Rule, which is the federal codes. The National Institutes of Health, the NIH, which is the primary funding agency for research, they have their own policies, and particularly with data sharing policies. And they have worked very hard to write policies that address tribal concerns. And this is one of the main things that we discuss on as a member of the NIH Tribal Advisory Committee. We talk about these things all the time. So the NIH is much more flexible than the federal guidelines are in as far as accepting tribes to certain of these guidelines. And so the NIH says that there are exceptions, and that NIH funded researchers have to follow laws, policies, and preferences of tribes, whether they're written or not. So they could just be oral, you know. And so all this stuff is we talked about earlier. These need to be addressed up front, because that, you know, when you as a tribe enters into a research agreement with a research institution, that really needs to be like a business agreement. Basically, you need to. Tribes may not be real savvy in the research arena yet in some tribes, but a lot of tribes are very savvy in the business arena. And I think that having that business negotiation mindset is how tribes need to approach entering into research agreements as well. And again, these are just some more of examples of our policies that we have written and put in place. And so we have in our policies that it describes the reach of our IRB review, which is only within the jurisdiction of the Chickasaw Nation. So research on Chickasaw citizens that might occur outside of the Chickasaw Nation, we do not review that research. So an individual Chickasaw person could enter into research agreement on their own. We review research and we keep the Chickasaw Nation's core values in mind when we review it. So it's not just the scientific methodology, but we have to we review it according to our tribal codes as well as our core values, and we decide whether or not research will be conducted here. As we saw in the Havasupai case, that a lot of the issues, the missteps and the abuses that occur in research is when they're published, right? So when they're published or presentation. So we have strict policies regarding, we have a dissemination policy that all research has to be reviewed by the Chickasaw Nation IRB before it is can be presented or released. And so we have to give it okay, and we have to give it an approval. So it's very important, you know, for tribes to have that right and that authority to pre-review any kind of publications or presentations. We also, even though we're Chickasaw Nation, our health center sees members from many different tribes And in publications or presentations, we do not allow tribes to be named. It has to just be very general. We could just say like, this was research that was conducted within the Chickasaw Nation, but you can't break down the individual participants by tribe. If you want to mention a particular tribe, you have to get permission from that particular tribe's authorities. And again, this is just there's a federal code that's called single IRB. That means if you have a large multi-site research project, the federal code said that only one IRB has to review that, and that makes it a little bit easier for the researchers because they don't have to go through multiple IRB review. There are exceptions to that for tribals, for tribes, but once again, that has to be written. And so we have a written policy that says all research has to be reviewed and approved by us, regardless of review by any other research review entity. The fact that any research data is owned by the Chickasaw Nation and it's not owned by the researchers is in our policies. And again, any use of data, including genomic data and secondary use of data that exists, all that has to be brought to the Chickasaw Nation IRB before it can be used. There are policies there are federal guidelines that say a research project may be exempt from IRB review, and that researchers can determine whether or not they feel like a research study can be exempt. We don't allow that in the Chickasaw Nation. Only the Chickasaw Nation IRB can determine whether or not a research study is exempt. And even if it is exempt, you still have to get prior review for any presentation or publication of findings. Additional protections that we have in our policies and in our protocols is we put expiration dates on permission for using data. It's usually 3 to 5 years after the end of the project, at which time you either have to get a new approval or you have to return the data. We always require an on-site tribal principal investigator. If you are going to do I keep doing that. If you're going to do a repository, if you want to sign people up for repositories, then you have to have a separate consent document for that. Right now, big repositories, big databases is what makes tribal review boards very uncomfortable right now, because the data is out there and in these broad databases and accessible to just about anybody. And so we're working really hard with some agencies to figure out how best we can protect our tribal data out there, because it's, once it's out there, it's hard to monitor. So that's all I have. We have lots of policies. We have a legal research agreement that we must enter into as well. So, but I will stop there and I'll stop sharing.